Hey everyone, it's Sean. I'm back with a intro to our gradient sort of section of this course. And in this video, I'm going to be walking you through what constitutes as a good gradient, a bad gradient, what makes them good and bad, and how to sort of avoid some of these mistakes when you create yours. This is going to be the first of a several part gradient sort of demonstration tutorial, so stick around for everything that we're going to cover, and it'll have you making much better gradients throughout your work. So let's just jump right in. In this example document, I have a bunch of different gradients set up on different artboards, and I want to sort of walk you through each one a little individually and explain when it is a bad gradient and what's going on here. So the first thing to sort of understand about gradients is that a gradient is made up of two or more colors, and they range from one start of the spectrum to the end of the spectrum, and in between you have what is called stops. In this example, I'm going to open up the gradient panel here so you can sort of see what's going on. I have a yellow color and I have a purple color, and they are flowing into one another. Now the problem with this one is you're getting this sort of murky, gross color in the center, and it's not really the greatest looking thing. So the reason for that is because these two colors need to have an extra color in the middle to sort of buffer the two of them out. There needs to be an extra, what you would refer to as a stop in the middle of it. And so to add that sort of extra stop, what I can do is I could just easily drag in an extra color, something ideally that sits between these guys on the color spectrum. We're going to get into this more as we move on throughout this video, but even something like in the sort of mid-orange, sort of mid-magenta sort of tone will automatically make this a much nicer looking gradient. So that is sort of one example of a bad meshed sort of gradient here. I'm just going to keep undoing until I can sort of get back to where we were. There we go. So you can see that there's more of a grayish, muddy sort of section. And the same thing in this example is happening. From one color to the next, these two don't jive together, so you're winding up with this sort of muddy gray tone. And one thing that you should sort of be aware of when we're dealing with gradients is how important colors really are. If we were to switch our colors over to when we're going to actually try and pick a color, what you want to sort of keep in mind, I'm under RGB, and with RGB, all of these numbers have values from 0 up to 255. 0 being black for all of them, and 255 being white for all of them. When all of these colors are represented by the same numeric value, in this case I'm going to use 50, you get this really gross sort of dingy blackish gray color, and so you really want to avoid those. When you're working with gradients, what I would suggest is you work in an RGB color space to get the most vibrant color possible. And if this is for an on-screen application, leave it as RGB. But if you're going to be putting this out for print material, then just convert your gradients to CMYK near the end of your workflow. That way you're working with the most vibrant colors possible as you design your work. So with that being said, the same thing can be applied when dealing with CMYK, except it's kind of the opposite. When all the color values are at 0, CMYK, you have white, and when you're dealing with all of the values at 100, you're left with this black color, except in CMYK it's referred to as key, and this is sort of CMYK's version of black, whereas this is actual true black. So just something to be aware of. It's similar instance, you want to sort of avoid having all of these colors be near each other in terms of numeric value, because they will create a really gross, dingy, sort of grayish color, which you can see is sort of happening in the middle of this gradient here. Again, to combat that, you would need to come in here and add in an extra color between them on the color wheel. I'm just going to switch this over to RGB so I can see better. And you might want to put in some sort of like a blue palette color just to sort of help bridge the gap between all three of them, but already you can sort of see there's a bit of an improvement happening. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this something called banding and color stops. Banding and color stops are really sort of interesting because they happen on screen really easily, and they also look very evident in printing. Banding is when you can see these tight bands of different color from one side of the gradient to the next. You can get rid of that using textures like noise and grain because it'll help to add some visual sort of noise to the entire gradient and help distract the viewer's eye. And in terms of color stops, when you're looking at colors that are very far away from each other on the spectrum, you get a lot of these stops that you can sort of see the exact part where the color is sort of transitioning from one shade into the next. So to avoid that, what you could do, what you sort of want to focus on when you're creating gradients is sort of trying to create more subtle gradients in your work. The subtler a gradient, the sort of less banding you're going to see and deal with. Sometimes though, depending on how good your screen is or the color depth of your work, banding and gradient stops are a little unavoidable, and you just sort of have to take measures into your own hands when dealing with them. But already this here is noticeably nicer in terms of banding issues than the black and white sort of example was. Now, if we come down here, this is an example of a much better gradient where you had two complementary colors, orange and teal, sort of fighting for each other in the middle. If I take this one shade out, you'll see what I mean. You get a really crappy sort of banding happening in the middle. It looks that gray and muddy tone again. So what we have to do is we have to put a color in between them that would naturally sit between them on the color wheel. I'll get into more about the color wheel and understanding color theory in the next video, but just goes to show you that you can create really nice gradients using some basic color knowledge and understanding within Illustrator. And sort of the next thing down here, rainbow gradients are really tacky and tend to get a bad name. If you build them properly, they can at least be applied relatively okay. I'm not advocating for the use of them at all, because I do think that aside from maybe pride events, there's really, or maybe kindergarten, there's really rarely a good usage for a rainbow gradient. But I could be wrong. You guys could come up with something better and different. But that's kind of the base understanding of gradients, is you want to make sure you're choosing colors that are either close to one another on the color spectrum, on the color wheel. And if you're choosing colors that are complementary or literally at opposite sides of the color wheel, then you need to remember to put in a color that would sit naturally between the two in order to help bridge that gap, because the goal here is to avoid dirty, muddy gradients. And if you're going to build gradients that are just very, very close to one another on the color wheel, hopefully the banding and the stops between don't cause too much of an issue. But if they do, just remember that you can always sort of cover it up by applying textures, by applying noise, anything to sort of help trick your eyes into not seeing the pattern that is those vertical stripes. So with that being said, in the next video, I'm going to show you guys color books, the color theory behind how the color wheel works, and how to use all of that to your benefit when creating a gradient. I'll see you there.